Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm returning to Ultimate General Civil War. This is part 2 of my new Union Let's Play. I started live streaming this a couple of weeks ago, and I need to get back to it, but this is from the original live stream that was a little bit over 2 hours long. In the first part of our video, we were talking about slavery in the Civil War, and we kind of had a general discussion around that. It wasn't really focused on the gameplay. This is going to be somewhat similar, although a different topic, hopefully less controversial. In this video, I'm going to be doing another top 5 list. I've done a few of these so far this year. So far, just the 2 I've done have been the ones I've done every year for the last 3 years. My top 5 most anticipated games of 2017 and my top 5 games of 2016. In this video, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. Occasionally, from time to time, I do book reviews on this channel while playing video games. And last year, I really got back into reading quite heavily, both Audible, audiobooks, which I don't know if you really count reading, but listening to books, and then also reading paper books, although I haven't done enough of that. And I've done a couple of video reviews. I think I'm up to like 7 or 8 on the channel where I talk about historical books or books dealing with historical topics. And in general, they seem pretty well received. So I decided I would do a top 5 favorite books of 2016. So my 5 favorite books from 2016 within the vein of them being about history. So I've read a bunch of the Gray Man series books as well as some of the other Tom Clancy books this year, which are just kind of, mindless sort of techno thriller, military porn type books. But I'm not going to include those in here. What these are going to be my top 5 favorite books about history that I read in 2016, because if nothing else, I'm the historical gamer, right? So I should be talking about historical books. Some of these I did do video reviews of on my channel, and in that case I'll link to them. Some of them I had hoped to do video reviews, but didn't get around to it. So this will be a mixture of books I've talked about and books that I haven't talked about. So the first book on my list, and this is in no particular order, I didn't rank them in terms of favorite, but my first book on the list is one that I intended to get to, but have not yet, anyway, done a review on the channel of. And that is a book by Jon Meacham called Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush. This was a fascinating read for me. It's really well done on Audible. I got the paperback version as well. It's published by Random House. It actually came out in late 2015. And the book details George Herbert Walker Bush, so the first Bush president, who was president from 1988 until 1992, Bush 41, I believe it was. And it's fascinating because it's a biography of George Bush, the first one. And it takes a look at his family's rise to prominence, his decision to move to Texas, his serving, and this is in no chronological order, but his service during World War II, sort of the expectations of what it meant to be a Bush. In many ways, the Bush family is the Kennedys of the Republican Party. Not as flashy, not as dynamic, not as good-looking or well-spoken or well-polished, not the Ivy League, not that they didn't go to Ivy League schools, but not the sort of Ivy League, all-American sort of perception of what it meant to be an American that the Kennedys kind of put off, but almost the conservative ideal, the reserved family man in service of his country, that sort of an ideal, at least that was held up. Not saying it was necessarily accomplished, but this mentality of what it meant to be well off in America at the time that Bush was coming up. There was this sense of duty, at least in this book that came off about Herbert Walker Bush. There was this sense that, he was well off, and yet the Bush's mentality was that you may be well off, but all that meant is you were expected to give back more to your society. You were expected to give back more to those who were less fortunate. And it's a fascinating tale of perhaps the ultimate pragmatist in the Republican Party after Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, undone by his own obsession with power, was a pragmatic leader to the T. a brilliant diplomat under him, Henry Kissinger, and obviously Nixon's presidency was well known for its diplomacy. Bush was less flashy. He was less perceived to be less accomplished. And yet this book follows Bush Sr. From his service in the military, actually all the way back from his birth, all the way through to his becoming a special envoy or ambassador to China, through to his service as the head of the CIA, eventually vice president, and then his role as president of the United States. It delves a little bit into his son as well, into GW. But for the most part, it focuses on the father. And I think it tells a compelling story. At times, it may not be critical enough of him or skeptical enough of him during, for example, the years that are looking at the Iran-Contra affair. But nonetheless, it really tells a remarkable story of a conservative Republican figure who was more in the vein of Eisenhower, I would say, than in the vein of the modern conservative president. He wasn't an evangelical. He was religious, but he always felt uncomfortable courting the religious elements of the Republican Party. He voted for civil rights legislation in the 90s. He voted for equal housing legislation in I think it was the 70s or 60s. So he's sort of a conservative, and yet not in the stereotypical opinion, at least of the left, of painting Republicans as being, aloof or disconnected from minorities or indifferent. You can see where the compassionate conservative element from his son's campaign came from. It came directly from sort of the ideals of what it meant to be a Bush, and this book really tells that story. So without a full-fledged review, I highly recommend it. Again, it could definitely be more critical of him. He certainly had failings, and I don't think the book exploited that as well as it could have. But it delves deeply into his personal diaries, into primary source evidence, and it does a very good job of painting a portrait of one of our country's, I would argue, one of our country's underappreciated presidents. Most people don't consider any president who doesn't serve 8 years a success. There's sort of the stigma of losing your reelection as being a failed president. And yet, some people, I don't mean to get political here, but there was certainly language that was being thrown around in the last presidential election of Hillary Clinton being one of the most qualified candidates for presidency. And regardless of your opinion on her, regardless of, what you think about her service or her politics, I always, whenever I saw that, I thought to myself, okay, I'm not saying she hasn't been in government a long time, but George Herbert Walker Bush, in my mind, if you look at the resume that he brought to the table going into the presidency, regardless of whether you agree with policy or not, that was a qualified president. That was someone who had served his country nobly and honorably. Again, whether you agree or disagree with his politics, really did a lot of service to this country, and I recommend the read. Okay, moving on, a book that I have talked about, and I probably won't spend a ton of time in this video because I have already talked about it in my own review. In number 2 in this list is Command and Control: Nuclear Weapons, the Damascus Accident, and the Illusions of Safety. This book deals, while its title is about the Damascus incident, which was a nuclear accident in the 1980s in rural Arkansas, speaking of the Clintons, while Bill Clinton was the governor of Arkansas, where there was an explosion at an American missile silo. The book really details a vibrant and interesting discussion of the history of nuclear weapons, as well as the accidents that occurred around them throughout the Cold War in the United States. It's a fascinating look at so many accidents that we didn't know occurred, and it's all told in a brilliant narrative style that at times feels more like you're reading a techno thriller than a historical book, than a book about history. It's called, again, Command and Control: Nuclear Weapons, the Damascus Accident, and the Illusion of Safety. It's written by Eric Schlosser, and I can't remember if this won a Pulitzer or if that was a different book on this list, but it was a stunning read. a fascinating look at so many different mistakes and accidents and safety procedures that were put in place during the Cold War for nuclear weapons, and how those often came so close to failing so miserably, from a nuclear weapon nearly going off just in North Carolina that would have covered Washington in fallout during President Kennedy's inauguration, to the 1980s and the various close calls that we had there. It's a fascinating look at American command and control around the nuclear weapons arm of the American military and the accidents that occurred around it. And that's all I'm really going to say about this book, because I've already done a review. If you're interested in more about this book, I'll throw the link in the description for the review of the book in my video. Moving on to number 3 on the list, another book that I've already reviewed on this channel is called The Dead Hand: The Untold Story of the Cold War Arms Race and Its Dangerous Legacy. This book is written by David E. Hoffman. Now I want to say this is the one that won the Pulitzer. It's another very well done book, and this details more about near-run nuclear exchanges, or at least that's how it kind of starts. Again, an impressively well-written book, and it details how the arms race ended in the Cold War. It really talks a lot about kind of Reagan and then the Bush years and sort of some missed opportunities that the United States had as the Soviet Union was coming apart, sort of how Bush was far more conservative. Again, we were talking about Bush earlier. He was far more conservative and skeptical of the Soviet breakup in Gorbachev than Reagan was. Reagan was more of a visionary moving forward, and yet it does a good job of talking about sort of this illusion of safety, about the nuclear material that exists in Russia after the Cold War, while also talking about various programs and weapon systems that were in place around the 1980s, the development of those weapons, and leading into the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. It's a really well done book, and I think it does a good job of talking a lot more from the Russian perspective than a lot of Western histories tend to do. It definitely relies heavily on Reagan memoirs and Reagan writings, but at the end of the day, it talks about the impact of things like The Day After Tomorrow, this, post-apocalyptic nuclear war film that shows ideal America being torn asunder by a devastating nuclear strike, and the impact that that has on Reagan, and then the eventual arms limitations and discussions that occur. And it talks about the actions of the Soviet Union as the Soviet Union becomes more and more taxed and more brittle and begins to slowly fall apart. All in all, it's a great book. If you're looking at a book that details the end of the Cold War with the perspective of nuclear weapons, biological weapons, just in general weapons of mass destruction, this is a good book to look at. If my memory serves me right, it also details quite extensively on the Soviet use of chemical weapons. Actually, yes, it does. The Soviet use of chemical weapons and biological weapons and the facilities that they put in place, and how haphazard security was around those when the Soviet Union fell apart, and this sort of secretive nature that surrounded all of them. So again, giving the book a little bit of short shrift in that I'm jumping right past it in a relatively short period of time, but another book on my list for top 5 books that I read in 2016 that were really impressive. It's a little bit older. It's a 2009 book, but it's very, very good. And with that said, number 4 on my list is a book called Duty: Memoirs of a Secretary of State, written by Robert M. Gates. This is a memoir of the Secretary of State. Robert Gates served the final 2 years of the Bush administration as Secretary of State, did I say? I meant Secretary of Defense. This is a book that details the final 2 years of the George W. Bush term during the troop surge in Iraq, under Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense, who replaced Donald Rumsfeld, who was Secretary for the first 6 years of the United States Bush administration. Gates then served 2 years under I can't speak tonight, guys. Then served 2 years under Barack Obama, something that I don't believe had ever occurred before, where a Secretary of Defense served under 2 different administrations of 2 different parties. The book is fascinating in that it really details more extensively, actually, for the Obama presidency, of sort of the inner workings of the Obama term, if you will. It talks a lot about sort of the conflicts between the different parts of the military and then as well as the political arms, how Biden and Gates, while they disagreed on almost all foreign policy, got along as individuals. How whether you like President Obama's policy or not, Gates seems to think very highly of him as an individual. And yet he seems to respect George W. Bush more as a leader in terms of his ability to work with the military as opposed to be conflicting with the military. It's a really interesting look at the last years of the United States in Iraq and the ramp up of troops in Afghanistan, and kind of is relevant today when we think about the rise of the Islamic State and the current state of the United States' military. Robert Gates is well regarded by pretty much everybody on both sides of the aisle. He's regarded as one of the most influential secretaries of defense. And the book also talks a lot about the personal side, about his struggles to send men into harm's way and being responsible for their death and their casualties, his efforts to try and make sure that troops had all the required equipment, everything they needed to fight and be effective while also being as safe as they could be, his pursuit of the MRAP, his pursuit of trying for some level of Pentagon reform in terms of acquisition, the acknowledgement that the acquisition system in the United States' military is broken, the acknowledgement that the Pentagon is dramatically over budget and dramatically overextended, and yet, the realization, at least during his term, that military budgets were not going to remain at the level that they were, and reforms had to be made. The fat had to be cut in order to ensure the American military would not lose substantial punching power as budgets eventually would begin to decline in the aftermath of the Iraq War. Also, his push for a surge in Afghanistan, the belief that the surge in Iraq was successful and that the same model could be applied to Afghanistan to try and salvage a deteriorating situation. Gates is a controversial figure. He's not all that well liked in some channels. The Army in general likes him in that he, definitely gave them priority because they were the ones fighting a land war. The Air Force was a little bit more ambivalent to him. Proposing cuts and being critical of the F-35 program, ending production of the F-22 at the assigned 187 units rather than expanding it. A lot of his budget cuts hit elements of the military that were not well regarded in terms of him. However, he managed the political game remarkably well, and outside of the military, in general, is regarded as one of the nation's best secretaries of defense since the end of World War II. Highly recommend the book. It's a little bit self-serving in parts. It's a memoir, so you need to keep that in mind. It's written by the subject, so obviously he's going to have some biases. But if you can judge by the length I'm talking about this book as opposed to the previous book, one of my favorite books. Just take a little bit of it with grains of salt in that, if you were writing a book about yourself, you probably wouldn't say too many unflattering things about yourself either. But seems like someone that would have been, if you were on his good side, not a bad man to serve under, and is the kind of figure I think we need more of. He's a self-proclaimed Republican. He served in George Bush's father's administration, served in George Bush's father's son's administration, and then served under Barack Obama, a conservative and yet someone willing to bridge the party line, someone that we need, frankly, more of. People willing to work both sides of the aisle, willing to be reasonable, willing to be pragmatic, and not to be extreme in all positions, but doing what he believed was best in the interest of the United States. The title of the book is well served for his sort of political philosophy. It's about duty. That's what it's the name of the book. His responsibility to the United States, his responsibility to his country, his duty to fulfill. And in that sense, it's a brilliant book, and I highly recommend it. And with that being said, number 5, the final book in this list, is another great book. It's called Masters of the Air. The air campaign over Europe in World War II has always been something that's fascinated me. And yet, whenever I've seen movies about it, whenever I've read books about it, I always feel like I'm getting only a part of the story. You hear the story told from the Schweinfurt raids, the early raids without the escort fighters. You hear the stories told about once the P-51 came in and the American bombers started to have reign of the sky over Germany. And you hear the story that the American bombing campaign and the British bombing campaign were largely ineffective in World War II, which is true for a large part of the war. But nothing ever seemed to put it together in an effective narrative. Nothing ever seemed to tell that whole story. And while I have a few quibbles with Masters of the Air, I can see why Tom Hanks is taking this book and creating a Band of Brothers type book around the air war in Europe for HBO in hopefully a couple of years, if that's all still on track. Masters of the Air came out in 2011. It was written by Donald L. Miller and tells the story of the American 8th Air Force from the early days in 1942 when it arrived and was launching raids with a half dozen or a dozen or two bombers to the late war years when 1,000 bomber raids would block out the sky in Europe and they would hit key transportation industries. It talks about the bombing campaign in Schweinfurt, the attempt to cripple the German war industry by hitting their ball bearings plants, and the absolute bloodbaths that ensued there. But the eventual attrition that even these raids that the Germans were putting up incredible casualties against the Americans were yet unawareingly the Americans were wearing the German Air Force down even then, and the slow degradation of the Germans' ability to defend themselves from Allied raids, the eventual shift to transportation and oil industries, which actually had a crippling blow on the German economy and the German ability to resist, yet the war ended too soon for people to fully appreciate the impact that the campaign had on the Germans. And yet this is more of a story of the bomber crews themselves. This book does a phenomenal job in weaving in the personal histories of these airmen who'd be shot down over Switzerland and the appalling conditions that the Swiss kept the American airmen in, basically German POWs in Switzerland, until the end of the war when the Swiss realized the writing was on the wall and began to become more pro-Allied than they were pro-German. An interesting book that tells the story of many courageous men and women who served, well, really mostly in this book men, but who served the American effort in World War II, the temptation for the Americans to switch to night bombing that ended up not occurring. My discussion is disjointed because it is such a phenomenal book. I rarely see books that are able to combine personal histories of the everyday soldiers with the overall narrative of what was going on at the general level, talking about the strategy and the effects of the raids, and then mixing in with the controversial topics, the bombing of Dresden, the firebombing that occurred, all while also grounding it in what the British were doing at the same time. This tells the full story from the American perspective of the 8th Air Force over Germany during World War II, and it is a must-read. If you haven't read it, read it. It is great. Again, Masters of the Air, the full title is Masters of the Air, America's Bomber Boys Who Fought the Air War Against Nazi Germany by Donald L. Miller. Go out and get it. I highly recommend it. So that's my list. The Masters of the Air, Dead Hand, Command and Control, Destiny and Power, and I'm forgetting one. I just walked through all of these. Wow, that's kind of actually embarrassing. Duty, about Robert Gates. A couple other honorable mentions, mainly because I think I read them in 2015. But there's an interesting book out there called A Better War by Louis Sorley. It's a little bit controversial in that it kind of talks the perspective of the American Vietnam War after Tet and how the American Army under Abrams was, winning in his eyes. I'm not quite so sure that's true, but it is an interesting book that tells about the later war years in Vietnam, which does not get talked about very often. Another book is called Hanoi's War by Lien Hang Nguyen, which is more about the perspective of the Vietnam War from the North, but it does an interesting job of telling how we have this perception of the war as unwinnable, and that the northern troops and the NVA were basically, unified around, we have to fight this forever, and we will never surrender until we successfully invade South Vietnam and unify the Vietnam nation. And it tells an interesting story of power and politics within North Vietnam, how at times the North was being worn down. There were elements who were more interested in peace. They were not convinced at all times that they were going to win, and tells about the war from the North Vietnamese perspective. So again, an interesting book, and that's kind of an honorable mention. Guys, I'll throw these book links into the description. If there's something you're interested in, you want to check them out, you want to go read them, you can click on the link, go to Amazon. If you buy it, I will get a cut. I'm letting you know that up front. This video itself is not intended to say go out and buy this stuff. But I guess my perspective is, if you are going to buy this because I'm telling you the books that I really enjoyed, then why shouldn't I get a cut? Because, screw the man, right? Like, hey, I told you about the books, so if you're interested in them, you go get them. I might as well take advantage of the Amazon affiliate program to get a little cut. But if you don't go out and buy it, I'm not trying to push you to do that. I'm just saying these are the books that I really enjoyed, and if you decide you want to pick it up, the links are in the description, and you can do that. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Again, this is the second part of my review or restart of the Union Let's Play of Ultimate General Civil War. This is dealing with the supply depot, a distress call battle. If we look at what's being fought on the screen, it's not a historical battle. It doesn't even have a historical name. I'm beating the Confederacy, with a little bit of time left, but I'm winning. So I didn't want to not include it, per se. But I don't have anything historically important to say about it, because it's not a battle that really happened. And I think more of the history will be interesting when we get to Bull Run. I am currently also reading a book called The Quartermaster, which is about the kind of principal, what's his name, John Marr, Robert Marr, or Meager, or something like that. I don't have it in front of me. But he was the principal architect of building the Union Army during the Civil War. So that'll be interesting to look at. I'll probably do a book review for that. That'll probably be something I'll weave into my next part of this series. But anyway, guys, I know there's still a little bit of time in this battle, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and cut the battle out. I'm going to end this video. I hope you enjoyed it. It'll probably be my last top 5 video, but don't quote me unless I do something like a top 5 Union generals and top 5 Confederate generals, although they're always the same people. So maybe like a top 5 underappreciated generals in the American Civil War. That could be something that would be interesting to do. But the channel's not going to become a top 5 channel per se. I'll just do a few of these every now and then when it's fun. And I thought, I shared my top 5 games, so why not share my top 5 books? Because I did 6 or 7 book reviews last year. So anyway, guys, I'm rambling at this point. So with all of that being said, I really do appreciate you guys tuning in. Hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts about the books. If any of you have read these before, or if there's anything that, you have any feedback, please let me know your thoughts. And until next time, guys, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and here's to a great 2017. It's already off to a good start. But until next time, guys, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.